The cold wind howled through the empty streets as Jake pulled into his driveway, exhausted from another long day at work. It had been snowing on and off all evening, leaving a thick white blanket across the neighborhood. He stepped out of his truck, rubbing his gloved hands together for warmth, when something unusual caught his eye, a dark shape barely visible against the snow in his front yard. At first, he thought it was just a pile of leaves, or maybe a forgotten trash bag, swept in by the wind. But as he walked closer, his stomach tightened. Lying there, motionless, was a German Shepherd. Jake's breath hitched. The dog's fur was speckled with frost, its body unnaturally still. He crouched down, his heart racing as he reached out and gently touched the dog's side. For a moment, he feared the worst, until he felt the faintest rise and fall of its chest. The dog was still alive, but barely. Just as he was about to scoop the animal up, a soft whimper broke through the icy silence. Jake turned his head and spotted something else curled up in the snow beside the shepherd. A tiny puppy, no older than a few weeks, shivering uncontrollably. Its small body was pressed against the larger dog, as if trying to soak up any last bit of warmth. Jake felt a lump rise in his throat. Who would leave them out here like this? He looked around, searching for any sign of an owner, but the street was empty. The only sound was the wind whipping through the trees. There was no time to waste. Carefully, he lifted the puppy into his jacket, shielding it from the cold. Then with a grunt, he gathered the larger shepherd into his arms. The dog barely reacted, its body limp against him. Jake could feel the ice clinging to its fur, the unnatural stiffness of its limbs. He rushed inside, kicking the door shut behind him. The warmth of his house was a stark contrast to the freezing night, and he wasted no time wrapping both animals in blankets. The puppy burrowed into the fabric immediately, but the shepherd remained eerily still. Jake grabbed his phone with shaking hands and called the nearest emergency vet. The minutes dragged by as he anxiously watched over the dogs, whispering reassurances. They likely couldn't even hear. Every second felt like an eternity. Finally, headlights cut through the night as the vet tech arrived. The woman quickly assessed the situation, checking the shepherd's pulse before lifting its eyelids. "Severe hypothermia," she muttered. "We need to get them both to the clinic now." Jake didn't hesitate. He grabbed his keys and followed her out to the van, his mind racing. How had they ended up in his yard? Who abandoned them in such brutal conditions? And most importantly, would they survive the night? But nothing could have prepared him for what he was about to find out. Because when the truth came to light, it would shake him to his core. Jake drove behind the vet van, gripping the wheel so tightly. His knuckles turned white. His mind raced with questions, each one more unsettling than the last. How long had the dogs been out in the cold? Had someone left them there on purpose? Were they lost? The thought of someone abandoning them in such brutal weather made his stomach twist, but he pushed the anger down. Right now, all that mattered was getting them help. The clinic was small but well equipped, and as soon as Jake stepped inside, the warmth hit him like a wave. The vet and her assistants were already working, carefully placing the German Shepherd on a heated pad while monitoring its vitals. The puppy, wrapped snugly in a soft towel, let out a tiny whimper, its body still trembling. "They were lucky," the vet said as she adjusted an IV for the larger dog. "Another hour out there, and I don't think they would have made it." Jake swallowed hard, his throat dry. Is he going to be okay?" The vet sighed, her face lined with concern. "It's too early to tell. His body temperature was dangerously low. The puppy is responding well to warmth. But the shepherd," she trailed off, shaking her head. "We'll do everything we can." Jake ran a hand through his hair. frustration, and worry knotting in his chest. He felt an unexpected connection to these dogs, as if fate had put them in his path for a reason. But why? Who did they belong to? While the vet worked, Jake paced the waiting room, trying to piece things together. He couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. If these dogs had owners, why hadn't they been looking for them? Why had they ended up in his yard, of all places? The whole situation felt off. After what felt like an eternity, the vet returned. The shepherd's stable for now, but he's extremely weak. We'll keep them both here overnight and monitor them closely. Jake exhaled, relieved but still uneasy. Do they have microchips? The vet nodded. We scanned them. The puppy doesn't have one, but the German shepherd does. The problem is, the information is strange. Jake's pulse quickened. Strange how? She hesitated before handing him a slip of paper with a name and phone number. The chip is registered, but the owner's details don't match up. Their address leads to an abandoned house on the other side of town, and the phone number is disconnected. Jake stared at the paper, a cold sensation creeping down his spine. Something wasn't adding up. Who registered this dog? And why were they nowhere to be found? The vet's voice pulled him from his thoughts. I did some quick digging, and it turns out this shepherd was reported missing nearly a year ago. The strange thing is, the report was closed without any follow-up, almost like someone didn't want the case looked into. Jake's heartbeat thundered in his ears. So, you're saying someone wanted this dog to disappear? The vet nodded grimly. That's what it looks like. A chill ran through Jake, but it had nothing to do with the winter air outside. He glanced at the shepherd, still unconscious on the exam table, his breathing shallow but steady. Who was this dog? And what had he been through? Determined to get answers, Jake made a decision. He wasn't going to walk away from this. If someone had tried to erase this dog's past, there had to be a reason, and he was going to find out what it was. But the deeper he dug, the darker things became, because as he started searching for clues, he had no idea that someone else was watching. Someone who wanted this secret to stay buried. Jake couldn't shake the uneasy feeling as he left the clinic that night. Something about this whole situation felt bigger than just two abandoned dogs. The German shepherd wasn't just lost. Someone had tried to make sure he was never found. And that meant someone out there had a secret they didn't want uncovered. Determined, Jake spent the next day digging for answers. He searched online for missing pet reports, scoured old social media posts, and even reached out to a few local animal shelters. But nothing concrete came up. It was as if the dog had simply vanished, until he took another look at the address, tied to the microchip, the abandoned house on the other side of town. Jake knew it was a long shot, but his gut told him he had to check it out. That afternoon, he drove across town, following winding roads, until he reached a small run-down property at the edge of a wooded area. The place looked forgotten, windows boarded up, weeds creeping through cracked pavement. He almost turned back, thinking it was a dead end, until he noticed something. In the snow near the back gate, there were fresh footprints. Someone had been here recently. Jake's pulse quickened. He stepped closer, carefully pushing open the rusted gate. It creaked loudly in the silence, but no one appeared. Then, as he moved toward the house, something on the ground caught his eye. A torn leash, half buried in the snow. It was old, weathered, but unmistakably a dog leash. Was this where the shepherd had come from? Before he could think, a voice called out behind him. What do you think you're doing? Jake spun around to see a man standing at the edge of the yard. He was middle-aged, bundled in a thick coat, his expression unreadable. But there was something about his eyes, nervous, wary. Jake held up his hands, keeping his tone calm. I found a dog in my yard last night, a German Shepherd. He had a microchip tied to this address. The man's face twitched ever so slightly. Never seen him. Jake narrowed his eyes. Then why is there a leash out here? The man hesitated, just a second too long, before shaking his head. You should leave. Jake felt it then, that shift in the air. Whoever this man was, he knew something, and he didn't want Jake asking questions. Listen, Jake said, stepping forward. That dog nearly froze to death last night. He had a puppy with him. If you know something, I said leave. The man's voice was sharper now, his stance rigid. Jake clenched his jaw, but knew he wasn't getting anywhere like this. Without another word, he backed away, retreating to his truck. But as he drove off, his mind raced. That man was hiding something, and Jake had a strong feeling the shepherd had escaped from this very place. But from what? That night, back at the vet clinic. Jake sat beside the shepherd's crate, watching him breathe steadily. The puppy had already started showing signs of energy, playfully pawing at a blanket. But the older dog, he had been through something bad. And then, as if on cue, the shepherd stirred. His eyes fluttered open, glassy at first, but slowly focusing. Jake leaned forward, heart pounding. Hey, buddy, he said softly. The dog blinked, then weakly. His tail gave the smallest wag. Jake exhaled, smiling for the first time in what felt like days. You're safe now. The vet, noticing the movement, rushed over, checking his vitals. He's responding. He's stronger than I thought. Jake nodded, watching as the shepherd tried to lift his head. For the first time, there was life behind his eyes. It was a small moment, but it meant everything. Over the next few days, as the dogs recovered, Jake continued his search for answers. He pieced together bits of information, slowly unraveling the mystery. It turned out the shepherd had once belonged to a family who reported him stolen months ago. They had searched for him, but the case had been quietly closed. Until now, with the help of authorities, Jake was able to track down the original owners. When they saw their dog again, tears filled their eyes. Max, they whispered, as the shepherd, now stronger, wagged his tail and nuzzled into them. It was a bittersweet moment. Jake had grown attached to the dogs, but he knew this was where Max belonged. As for the puppy, the owners had no idea where she had come from, but they had an idea. Max must have found her and taken care of her, they said. Maybe he was protecting her this whole time. And just like that, Jake realized Max had never been alone in that yard. He had survived not just for himself, but for the puppy. Even in the worst conditions, he had refused to let her go. In the end, the family welcomed the puppy into their home as well, keeping her as part of their family. Jake left that day knowing he had done the right thing, even if it had led him down an unexpected path. As he drove home, he glanced at his now empty passenger seat and smiled. He had started this journey by finding 2 freezing dogs in his yard, but somewhere along the way,